Good morning, everyone. I'm beyond excited to bring you an amazing person to the Everyday Heroes podcast. He is the person that is changing lives. He is the person that is making things happen for autistic kids that I thought was never even a possibility. I want to introduce you to Dr. Robert Melillo, a world-renowned expert in brain health, especially childhood and adult neurological disorders. He is a clinical professor, brain researcher, and best-selling author of the book Disconnected Kids, which we will be talking about later. He focuses on ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, anxiety, and other developmental neurological issues. Dr. Melillo is a best-selling author and leading figure in functional neuroscience dedicated to bridging the gap between brain function, behavior, and physical health. He uses his extensive knowledge of neuroanatomy and brain function to understand the root causes and correction of most neurobehavior issues. His innovative multimodal approach, the Melillo method, has transformed the lives of thousands of patients of all ages. So please help me welcome Dr. Melillo to the Everyday Heroes podcast. How are you, Dr. Melillo?
I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's very nice to be with you. I appreciate you inviting me.
Oh, thank you. So for those of us who maybe aren't as well-connected, well-researched as you, can you just give us a little bit more insight into what is a neurodevelopment disorder? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, obviously, it starts with understanding the brain and brain development. And, there are different types, obviously. There are some disorders that are related to genetic mutations, things like Down syndrome or Fragile X. And then, of course, there could be brain injuries and there could be metabolic disorders. But the vast majority of most neurobehavioral disorders in children and adults really have to do with some glitch in the way that they grow and the way that they develop. And there's usually a maturational delay where the brains are just not or delayed in their growing, and then they develop these developmental imbalances that cause certain networks in the brain to maybe come online too early and too strong and produce symptoms because they're overactive, like things like tics or stimming or other types of anger outbursts or OCD behaviors. And then there's also underdevelopment and immaturity in networks on the other side of the brain that also produce symptoms like lack of nonverbal communication or diminished nonverbal communication or not feeling their body or low interoception and proprioception or underdevelopment and overdevelopment of the immune responses and inflammation. So they're really a combination of these things, and they are unique to each individual, but there's an overall basic pattern to them that, in my research in our lab is referred to as a functional disconnection, where networks just aren't syncing up and communicating. And this imbalance is what produces the variety of symptoms.
I love that so much. And it's through the book, guys. I'm telling you right now, I'm going to be linking it about 4,000 times on socials because I just love this book. This is a book that should be read for any parent who's looking to conceive and for parents of babies. Don't read the baby books. This has more information in it than any baby book I've ever read. And so what we're talking about when we talk about this disconnection, are we talking about the brain hemispheres, the left and the right brain hemispheres not being connected? So can you just elaborate a little bit more about that? Because most people may or may not have heard of your work. So I want them to get a real understanding of what it is that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it all started with me as a parent of 3 kids that had really amazing abilities and gifts, but also struggled in areas. And they were healthy, and my wife and I are healthy, and we provide a really good environment for them. And so, having a background in neuroscience and functional neurology and functional neuroimmunology, I had a good foundation. I was already teaching clinical neurology on a postgraduate level, starting to do some brain research. And I wanted to know what is actually happening in their brain. I mean, what is the actual issue? And, the fact that they were really good at certain things and really struggled with other things, to me didn't make sense, as it doesn't to a lot of parents. And so, and I wanted to understand that at a deeper level. And I went around and, tried to ask people that could give me some information. And again, I have a very strong rehab background. I've been in neuro rehab my whole career. And so, I wanted to see what could I do about it? How could I change it and help my own children? And, people would just say, well, we have no idea what's actually happening in the brain, and nobody really knows, and there's nothing you can do about it. And right off the bat, I said, that doesn't make much sense. You're just telling me you don't know what it is, but you're absolutely certain that nothing can be done about it. There isn't an injury. There isn't genetic mutation the majority of the time. Most of these kids are relatively healthy, and the kids I work with are raised in great families, so they're not necessarily, trauma. So what's the problem, and why can't you change it? It didn't make sense to me. And then, how it also affects the body. We see that there are issues with the gut. There's issues with the immune system. There's issues with their detox system, food sensitivities. How does that all work? Where does that come together? And so as I started really diving into the research in the early 90s, that's when brain imaging was just really starting to become available. And we could really look at the brain in a much more functional way. And what it became clear is that there weren't any injuries or any damage. There wasn't any localized problems in the brain. That the concept of problems with functional connectivity, with the way that the brain was connecting and communicating, and that the hemispheres in particular, the way they develop in a certain sequence. And so that's where the greatest vulnerability is. It's our greatest ability, is that we have these two sides of our brain that do different things, but it also is a vulnerability. So it was all about understanding development. So I really spent a lot of time trying to understand human brain development, which is very unique. And eventually I got a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience, because I really wanted to understand it at the deepest level, but not just to understand it, to be able to say, what can we do to change it?
Oh, I love that so much. And it was funny that you talk about the gut, because I'd always thought, well, and I've always heard, if the gut is out, the brain is out, right? Thinking that the gut was the thing that was the first primary thing. But you say in the book that if the brain is out, then the gut can't mature. And so that's when we see a lot of those intolerances, sensitivities, all that sort of stuff. So that alone blew my mind, because I was thinking, yeah, it all starts in here. But we, as parents, we don't have your background. So I love that we're able to even have an option to go to venues like this, that we can be supported. Because on a side note, guys, everyone who's listening, the gains that I have seen my son go through with this program has been nothing short of amazing. So I definitely reckon, go and find your latest clinic. I know it's a complete shame. I'm totally plugging it, and I don't care, because I think that your work is amazing. How does a child develop a neurodevelopment disorder rather? You just said that it doesn't come from trauma. It doesn't necessarily come from anything else. How do we find our children, non-speaking, having, gross or fine motor skill issues, a range of other bits and pieces? What happens?
Well, it really is about understanding that the human brain is unique amongst every other brain on the planet. No other brain develops like the human brain. Even though our brains are really the amalgamation of many other brains that have existed on this planet, we have a couple of unique features. One is that we have the largest brain per body size of any primate, but because we're the only bipedal primates, we have the smallest birth canal. So we have really big heads with a really small birth canal. So right from the beginning, that makes human brain development different. And we've had to develop mechanisms to restrict our brain development in the womb, because if it just grew, we wouldn't get the head out. So that our genes that regulate brain development, and that's about 84% of our genes, are active during brain development. And those genes are designed to be very sensitive to the environment so that they can know when they're in the womb versus when they're outside the womb, and when to grow and when not to grow too fast. So that gives us an advantage because our brains are the most adaptable brains, and the genes that regulate the brain are the most adaptable and sensitive genes, but they're also the most vulnerable. And so, most other animals, the vast majority of their brain grows and their head grows in the womb or in the egg or wherever they are. So in a controlled setting. But in human brain, because we have to keep it restricted, we only have about 20 to 25% of our adult brain developed at birth. So that means that 75 to 80% of our brain grows outside the womb in an uncontrolled setting. And as we said, the genes that regulate that are very sensitive to the environment, which again makes our brain the most adaptable brain, which is a great advantage. So we can adapt to any environment that we're growing in. But it also means that if we don't get the proper environmental stimulus at the right time in the right way, or we get the wrong stimulus at the wrong time, it can throw off the trajectory of development. And that can lead to a problem where it can slow brain development or limit it. And then the right brain develops first in the womb, and for the first 3 years, it takes the lead and keeps the left brain down in check. And then at 3 years, the left brain comes up, and then it develops for the next 3 years. And then at 6 years, we have the foundation of the right and left brain. And again, we know that all brains have a right and left side. From the very beginning of time, we've published research on this going back, 500 million years in the fossil record, that brains at that time seem to have been lateralized. But we also know that as you go up the animal kingdom, the more asymmetric the right and left brain are, the more different they are, the more complicated the brain is, and the more intelligent the animal is. But it also means that the brain needs to be really synchronized and fast and really work together. And so that's another vulnerability. And those two things together, to me, are the foundational problem. If something delays the onset of brain development and keeps it immature, and then creates this imbalance. And once that imbalance starts, like I said, it can create symptoms from overactivity of certain areas, and then underactivity and underdevelopment. And depending on what networks and what areas of the brain and which ones more over the other, it can have a whole variety of symptoms. And it makes up basically the whole spectrum of mental health and the whole spectrum of autism. I've spent over 30 years trying to come up with a universal model of autism because it's the most challenging to understand. How do you explain all of the children on this spectrum or adults and all of the symptoms that you see in their body? And how do you explain that in one model? And that's what I've been able to do.
I love the part in the book where you actually go through exercises that parents can do at home to actually check to see if your child is more left or right brained. And they're so easy. They're such easy exercises to do that I'm tempted to do them on my daughter and my husband, actually, and myself, just to see, right? Just because I'm so curious. I love to see how we show up and what the differences are. And it's written. When I'm not a big, I like to listen to a lot of audiobooks, but when I got your book and I was like reading, I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? But it's such an easy read. So for parents who think that they can't read it, it's not written clinically. It's written very much in layman terms where it's easy to digest. And I've probably spent a large portion of my highlighter highlighting a lot of pages. But it's definitely an amazing book. Outside, I guess, of your work with the brain balance programs, what can be done for a child who has a delay?
Well, there's a lot that can be done because, there's so many different things that are impacting it and that can be used as tools to change the brain. The bottom line is what I tell parents all the time: the kids that are most vulnerable and the people that are most vulnerable are actually the ones that tend to be the most gifted in an area of the brain. And that, again, it makes them more susceptible to an imbalance. So, I want parents to understand that you didn't do anything wrong. Like, a lot of people don't tell you that. And obviously we all feel like we must have done something wrong somewhere, or we're not parenting right or whatever. it's actually that you've given your child a gift, and that's built on traits. It's built on, what natural traits, like, are you more of a left brain dominant thinking person or a right brain dominant thinking? We know, and the research really clearly shows that kids that develop autism, the parents and family members are extremely intelligent, and they have more what we would describe as an engineering technical brain, right? So they're more left brain by nature, and their personality is that. And, they just see the world through that lens a little bit more. And most people have fairly balanced brains, so they're not labeled with any disability, but we all have our strengths and weaknesses. We have certain things that we're really good. People that are very technical, and that have good left brain skills, they may, read early on and well. They may be really good in math or science or details or memory for facts. They're very goal directed, and they're very linear and logical in their thinking, and they may be very good at verbal skills, but they may not be as good with social interactions. They may not be as good at reading people or situations. Both sides of the brain are creative, but in very different ways. We know that the typical creative type of person that we think of as the artist and the musician or the athlete or the designer or, someone that just is a people person, that is really good at reading people and reading situations, they tend to be more right brain. But we get, like the classical musician or the really fine artist or an architect, they tend to be a little bit more left brain. But if this imbalance comes about where these kids are born with unusually strong traits, and if that left brain comes online too early before the right brain is fully developed, it then shuts down. And there's a delicate balance. The brain is very dynamic, and it's designed to be that way. And so that information just flows back and forth. And this imbalance should not become too much. If it does, it now blocks the flow of information. And we tend to, have areas that are overactive, and that becomes highly accentuated. And then other areas like our weaknesses may be also accentuated. And the degree to that is really what we look at, the severity or the difference in an autism spectrum. Why are some very high functioning, highly intelligent, maybe, we used to be in the Asperger's realm, but functional. And then you get others that can't speak and can't function and can't control their body at all. And, they may have a lot of immune issues. And as you said, the problem, most people are told that the problem starts in the gut and it starts with inflammation. That's not true. It actually, it starts in the brain and the brainstem and the regulation of what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and how that regulates the immune system. And that's what affects the gut development and affects the production of acid and enzymes and causes malabsorption. And then that leads to inflammation, and that has an impact on the brain, and it does have an impact on the symptoms, but that's not where it starts. That's not the root cause.
So interesting. One of the things that I loved about the book, which, first of all, before I get into that, thank you so much for saying as a mum that it wasn't our fault, because as a doctor and as a very intelligent person, it's so lovely to hear that. I have had horror stories told to me by parents. I've had my own fair share of horror stories. And I just think it's so lovely to hear someone as esteemed as you to be able to say it wasn't our fault, because I think that we carry a lot of grief with us, that there was a lot of blame and a lot of shame that somehow we took the medication, we sat too close to the computer, we watched too much of the iPhone, we ate something and you try to find an answer because you feel like you want to blame somebody. You want to put this grief onto somebody's shoulders because you feel like you can't carry it anymore. And
Right.
I hear this time and time again from my clients around just how heavy that weight is to carry. So thank you for that. One of the things that I loved reading in the book was, and which was a massive red flag, was if your child goes from basically sitting to, well, not necessarily sitting, but going from sitting to walking and missing the whole crawling stage, and how big of a milestone that is to miss. Can you just quickly just give us a bit of insight into that? Because there might be parents out there right now who I know when I was raising my children that if a child went from I missed the crawling and went straight into walking, I would have been like, gosh, that kid is smart. Like, that is amazing. But you're saying, no, it's actually a big red flag. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, well, that's where understanding the uniqueness of human brain development, that unfortunately, pediatricians, pediatric neurologists, they really don't understand that because they're not neuroscientists. And so, they look at the brain development and when we see that it goes off track, if they don't hit a milestone, they don't know what that means and they don't know what to do about it. So their attitude is, well, let's just keep the mom and the dad calm and not add more stress. And let's just sit back and wait and see what happens. And, they are trying, I think, to be, they're not trying to do things bad, but we understand that the human brain is one of the most complex things in the universe. And so we would expect that the way it's built is very specific. There's a very specific developmental blueprint, and all of the steps matter. And even going to pre-birth, and we talked about movement. Brains developed on this planet and evolved because a living thing moved. Living things that don't move don't have brains. So movement is what initiates brains, and movement is what initiates the development of our brains. And our brains are so immature in the womb and early in the first, couple of years that we don't really have, a baby doesn't have control over their movement. Human babies are really, have very little control. A horse can run in under 2 hours after they're born. We won't walk until we're about a year. And all of those stages, and as we said, because most of our brain happens outside the womb, all of those steps matter. They're part of building it. It's like building a house. You have to build each floor one by one, starting with the foundation. And if you don't have a good foundation, then, everything on top of it is not going to be the way it should be. And we have the longest period of gestation, and all of the big stuff like speech and language and attention and emotional regulation are towards the end. So any little deviation in that blueprint actually has a big impact on the end result. And so that's why paying attention to those milestones are hugely important. Even the pre-birth movements, my main research is in what we call primitive reflexes. Primitive or neonatal reflexes are the foundation of movement in humans. And they're these automated movements that we're born with from our brainstem because we don't have a brain to really control our movement, but they allow us to go through movement stages to interact with our environment, engage our senses, activate these genes that cause our brain to grow. And if we're not moving or interacting in the right way, we're not getting that type of feedback, we're not stimulating these genes, and that alters the way the brain grows, which then alters the way it's going to end up in our behavior and our functioning, and depending on that level of deviation. So that's why, like, even looking at, at the third trimester, babies should miraculously somehow turn upside down and backwards and do that without the cord getting wrapped around their neck. They should be deep enough down in the birth canal that they induce the birth process, and then they use those reflexes to do it. If they're not there, like if they're a breech, or if they're sunny side up, or if they have a cord wrapped around them, or if they're not deep enough down in the canal and the mom needs to be induced, or if they get stuck and there needs to be a C-section, they're supposed to use these reflexes to come out of the birth canal. They literally push themselves out. And then the first milestone outside is the rooting and sucking reflex, where they should be able to latch on if a mom chooses to breastfeed. And so, 85% of the kids, maybe 90% of the kids that, especially non-speaking, that we work with, they couldn't latch on. And they had issues around their birth process. And then they should roll over. And they should be okay being on their belly. If they don't like being on their belly, that's a red flag right there. Then they should do a commando crawl on their belly. Most parents don't even know kids are supposed to do that. And they do that for a period of time. And then they get up on all fours, and then they sit up, and then they should crawl. And then they should do that for a period of time. And right around 12 months, at about 11 to 13 months, every kid should walk a few steps, they should talk a few words, and they should have good pointing and joint attention. If they don't hit those 3 milestones, there's a problem. And the problem is that these reflexes haven't come on when they were supposed to, and they don't go away. And if they don't go away, now they hold back brain development and they keep it in a more immature state, and they lead to these imbalances. And once that's there, it won't self-correct, and it may actually even get worse as time goes on.
It's fascinating to see, especially about the primitive reflexes. I remember when my son first started we actually go to Brain Fit Kids, and just seeing his reaction to, like, the feet doing the with the pencil going up the feet, or on the hands, and just seeing how he was, his toes would crawl down. But now there's just nothing, he's completely fine with having it done. And I just think, gosh, look how far we've come with the development in such a short amount of time. So nothing is lost. I hope for parents who are listening, nothing is lost. There is always hope. There is always a way forward. So, when you're in those moments where you feel like, I just want to give up and I don't know where else to turn or what to do, this is the podcast for you. This is where we need to go. This is how we can help our children. Because if we don't take the steering wheel and guide them to where they need to go, how can we help? How can we actually get the support that they need? Like, it's impossible. And there's so much information out there. It's very hard to decipher where to go, what to do, how to do it. So this is why these podcast episodes are so brilliant, being able to share information. In terms of the results from the therapy with the Brain Balance program, what can parents expect from the therapy? What can they expect to see with their child?
Well, the Brain Balance program was really the first earliest model I created. And it was really more of a non-medical, it was more working with kids that were higher functioning, and it's been very effective with the centers. But I really wanted to come up with answers for the most challenging issues, especially non-speaking autism, but also not just in children, but in adults, because understanding human brain development, and I also have a degree in neuropsychology, you understand that almost all adult psychological issues really start in childhood. It's all development. And so understanding how the brain develops, is so important. And, all of this really came together when I started, working with it. And so the Melillo method is a more advanced model. That's what I've been working on really over the past 10 years or so. And we've really been refining it, where now we bring in really advanced medical tools and scientific research and really high level of neuroimmunology. And we have, health professionals that work with us. And we've done a lot of research in this area. And so, that's where we've been able to really, and even like spelling techniques for kids that are non-speaking, that help as a bridge to get them to speak. The idea, as you said, the hope that, the brain can change. And the problem is that first question I ask parents that come in from all over the world into New York to see us is, has anybody ever tried to explain to you what's actually happening in your child's brain? And all the therapies out there, although they're well-intentioned and people are trained well, they look at one piece and they're just trying to manage symptoms and behaviors, even medication. Again, none of it deals with the root cause. It deals with, one piece of the puzzle and tries to just manage that or improve that one thing. But it's an integrated system. The brain and the body is an integrated system. And unless you understand how that whole system works together, how it grows, how it develops, and where it can go wrong, then you're not going to understand the root cause. And I've never met a parent who said to me, yeah, I don't want to understand what the root cause of the problem is, right? And you can't change it. Like over the past several years, a lot of my research has been trying to understand why kids that don't speak on the autism spectrum, why can't they speak? No one's ever explained that, by the way. And many of these kids are hyperlexic, which means they're reading at 1 or 2 years of age. So the same areas of the brain that we read with are similar to the areas we speak with, So if they're advanced in that, why wouldn't they be able to speak? So really understanding that, and understanding that it's because of this right brain delay, and because they have this loss of connection to their body. They don't feel their body. They usually have very low, what's called interoception. They may have a high pain threshold. They may not feel temperature. They may not really understand hunger or thirst or feeling full. They may have trouble with feeling when they have to go to the bathroom, or feeling tired so they don't sleep. And then that leads to a deficit in what we call proprioception, and building a 3D map of their brain, sensory map, and then a motor map. And so a lot of people are told, well, it's just dyspraxia. It's purely a motor problem. And that's not true either. It really starts with a sensory issue, and also lack of development of these social brain and attachment. That really is the core problem. And then this all obviously plays a role on the development of, as we said, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and how it's going to regulate the digestive system and the maturity of it, and the immune system. And the brain takes the lead. This is the really cool thing that we're finding now in research, is that the brain takes the lead in the immune system and in the autonomic system. And even most immunologists have no idea about that. But there's a whole new thing, like the area of the brain in the right side called the insula, which is where we feel interoception, where we feel pain. It's also where we feel empathy. It's also an area of the brain that leads to what we call immunoception, meaning it registers inflammation and anti-inflammation, and tries to keep the balance of that. And so when we see a child that's chronically inflamed, or can't regulate or can't sleep, we see that same area of the brain where they don't feel their body is the same area that they also can't regulate or can't dampen inflammation in their body.
Gosh, I feel like we've got such a long way to go to understand the brain. You definitely have a better understanding of it than most people do, but there still seems to be like so much information that we have no idea how it even functions and how it does the things. But I'm glad that you are able to uncover so many of those things. The last question before we get into some other bits and pieces, but how do parents help their child? How do we move forward with getting the right support for our child?
Well, as you said, it comes to understanding because nobody's telling you this, right? Most of the parents, they come to me and they just feel so alone. They feel so lost. Again, they can't help but blame themselves or each other, and no one's giving them real information, and they don't even realize that it's out there. They don't even know what questions to ask, right? And so just being able to understand, and I mean, I'm a researcher, so everything I'm talking about, is well researched, and we've published, more research than anybody in the world in regard to primitive reflexes and a lot of this stuff. So I never just say anything, and I won't recommend things unless I really feel that it's evidence-based, and unless we've used it. But it starts, I think, with reading my book. I think that's a really good place to start. I have 8 books that I've written. I have written a book on preconception. And a lot of the things that are coming out now that RFK is talking about, I wrote about in a book in 2013 called Autism, the Scientific Truth of Preventing, Diagnosing, and Treating Autism Spectrum Disorder, and what parents can do now. So, and I wrote that book because many parents, over years of working with children with developmental issues, would come to me and say, listen, we want to have other children, but we're afraid, we're afraid. And is there something that we can do to, lower our chances? So I really dove into the research and spent a lot of time looking at it, and, identified what are fairly well-known risk factors. You can't say they cause anything, right? Like you can't say Tylenol in a mom causes autism, but there is a correlation, right? But what does that correlation mean? But it's really good to inform yourself that, okay, if there are these different correlations and there are things that we can do. And by the way, the risk factors are equal in men and women. So this isn't just on moms and women. And most of the risk factors are preconception, meaning there are things that you might be able to do and identify and be able to get yourself into a situation in both men and women that may lower your risk. But either way, after the fact, we can change it because there is no damage, there is no injury, there is no genetic mutation. But understanding the book and understanding what the issues are, and as you said in that book, I also give parents a way of assessing their own child and really themselves, because a lot of parents come back because these are built on traits. And a lot of them come back and say, when I went through this right and left brain checklist in my child, not only did it make so much sense and describe my child for the first time, but it's really describing me, or it's describing my husband, and what he was like as a kid. And so it really gives you a way of assessing your child in multiple areas, in the sensory realm, in the motor realm, in the neuroimmune area, in the academic and cognitive areas. And that you can then take that to start to put together. One, you can understand, was there something that went off? What are the real milestones that nobody's telling me? And if they miss those milestones, then that tells me that there was a developmental issue. And then, what can we do to actually put together some sort of program to start helping my child and work with them and, really be able to do it in a measurable way, because I give you a way to really measure it. But there's also, we've published a lot of research papers. Some parents out there want to read those research papers. And so I have over 100 papers. They're all open access. You can Google my name and go on PubMed, or you can go on Google Scholar and you can get these papers. We've published about 10 papers just in the last 3 or 4 years. We just published a major paper in Brain Sciences that the title of it is Autism. What do we know? And, what can we do now? Right. So it's basically a synopsis of the whole, of all the scientific literature, others and ours, and saying, what do we really know about autism, and what can we do? What's the reality of this? And so I think there's a lot of material out there for people to educate themselves and understand what's going on. And then I've trained over 10,000 health professionals around the world in almost every country of all different specialties. And they're out there, like, you go to Michelle, and, she's someone who studied my work for years, and, they're out there helping people. And there's other people in Australia, many doctors that are using, we have a fellowship course that people go through and become certified. And so there's a lot of resources out there, but it really starts with just getting real information and understanding what is the root cause and what can be done to change it.
I love that so much. And I love that you're doing all of the papers and writing the books and doing the things to get that information out there. This is so, so important. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. Before we wrap this up, I just wanted to, I know that you have a free ebook that you are allowing people to download. Can you share a little bit more about the ebook and what it is?
Yeah, I think the ebook that we're making available for you is, I'm not sure if it's the primitive reflex one, or
I think it's the elimination diet.
Elimination diet, right? So, we have a couple of them out there, but one of the ones is, when you're dealing with, again, we said the problem doesn't start in the gut. It doesn't start with inflammation. It starts with the brain. It starts with this imbalance of the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system and the lack of development of the parasympathetic rest and digest that keeps the gut. When we're born, everybody hears about leaky gut, right? Well, we're born with a leaky gut. Most people don't know that. Most doctors don't know that. They think it happens somewhere down the road, but we're born with an open, leaky gut, and that's for a reason. Our sympathetic nervous system is online when we're first born, and it's designed to keep our gut really not really functioning very much because we don't need it, but we want the gut to be leaky and open when we're first born, because babies don't produce antibodies until around the end of the first year, if they develop properly. And so they need to get the antibodies from the mom's breast milk. Those are very large protein immunoglobulins that wouldn't get through a normal, mature, closed up stomach lining. So they're supposed to be leaky. And in the beginning, we're not producing acid and enzymes because that would kill those antibodies in the baby's gut. And they don't have a lot of blood flow and they don't have a lot of movement because they don't have solid waste in the beginning. But then once they start maturing and going through these milestones in that first year and hitting them and getting rid of these primitive reflexes as they come on, and they start to eat solid food, and they start to, make their own antibodies, now another nuclei in the brainstem, in the area where all of these reflexes should be going away from, called the parasympathetic nuclei, turns on, and now it gets the gut to start to close up, so large proteins aren't getting through. It starts to produce acid and enzymes so that we can break down solid food that we're starting to eat. And it actually now sets the proper environment so that good bacteria can thrive, and bad bacteria and viruses and yeast and fungus and mold and parasites can exist. If a baby has, candida, or if it has a parasite, or if there's mold, your gut isn't working because you aren't producing acid and enzymes. You need those acid and enzymes to break down and to be able to absorb folic acid or B12 or all the things that we're hearing a lot of. And so then we need blood flow to be able to come to the gut so we can absorb these nutrients and these vitamins, and that we need to now move this waste along. At the same time, we need to balance out parts of the immune system that produce antibodies and that also produce white blood cells. And what we see is these kids have a dominant, what's called Th2 system. Their B cells are too sensitive. They're producing too many antibodies. Both of these things, this open, leaky gut with this immune system shifted towards inflammation and overly sensitive antibodies, can lead to food sensitivities. And then food sensitivities can then trigger inflammation, which can impact the brain. So one of the most basic things is to really do an elimination diet, to try to identify what foods, and every child is different. There's no one diet that works. I prefer to do blood tests to look for antibodies against foods, and it's very different. We should never have an antibody against food. We shouldn't have antibodies against our own body. Most of the kids we work with have eczema, or they may develop antibodies against their brain, as in PANS or PANDAS, or antibodies against their folate receptors. They never should develop those antibodies. So they're developing them because the brain is out of balance. But we want to dampen inflammation, and we want to identify what these triggers are while we're changing the brain. And there are different supplements we can use to actually help balance that immune system as well. But, this is one of the most basic things. And so I wrote a really basic instruction manual as how to do a proper elimination diet, and then challenge, and understanding it from a neuro perspective. So I also wrote a book called the Disconnected Kid Nutrition Plan, which is a whole book about this, and really is specific about looking at diet and nutrition and immunology from a neuro perspective, and that's also out there. But this is like a small version of that.
Yeah, that's amazing, because at least that's something that parents have control over, right? Where we feel like a lot of it is out of our control. In this case, we can really take this guide and put it into practice and see what happens when we do reintroduce or take away these foods, and see what happens with the child. I love that so much. Obviously, people would love to know, obviously we're very far away from New York, but what's your waiting list looking like? Are you booked out for like years in advance, or how does that work?
No, I mean, the fact is that, we developed 2 centers so that we could accommodate people. One of the biggest complaints we hear from people all over the world is there's such a waiting list just to get their child diagnosed. I mean, people wait 2 years to get in to see a doctor, which to me is tragic, right? Because everybody talks about early intervention is the key, but yet they make kids wait 2 years to even get a diagnosis. So I want to make sure that people have the availability when they're ready. And so we have, pretty good capacity in both of our offices. We can see a lot of patients. Everybody gets individualized plans and care. So, there's a little bit of a wait, but it's not too long. And so, when you're ready and someone comes to the conclusion, and a lot of parents are going to have a sense of urgency, because the earlier we get to these things, the better. And it's never too early, but it's also never too late. We work with adults. We work with all age groups. So, if people want to come and see us, they can go to my website, drrobertmelillo.com. They can email us at info@ drrobertmelillo.com. People message me on Instagram, and we respond, and I respond, and my assistant responds. So we try to be very responsive and get people in as quickly as possible. And so, we're able to do that without too long of a wait, fortunately.
That's amazing. I know so many people will be looking into the website a bit more because your work is so inspiring, and it's so wonderful to know that, like I said, that there is a solution out there, something that can assist with so many children who are non-speaking, so many children who have so many developmental delays, and that we are so grateful that you have created something that can help them. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Melillo. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, just, again, for one of the things that's been the most fascinating over the last few years is we started working with spelling in our office with non-speaking kids. And, I was exposed to this. In the beginning, I was skeptical, but then, I started to understand the science underneath it, because these kids are so disconnected from their body, and it looks to the outside world like they don't know anything, and they're given an intellectual disability. And the fact is, I always knew that these kids were brilliant, right? These kids are geniuses, like beyond geniuses, but yet, they're treated like, people treat them like they're not there, like they don't hear, like they're deaf. And so being able to give them a way of communicating while we're working to get them to speak. When the spelling came along, it's really incredible, because with the right technique, there's what's called RPM, and then there's S2C, and spell to speak. And with the right technique, these children they can't type, and they can't write, and they can't speak. But if you do it with them, they can type on a letterboard. And it's remarkable. Many of these kids who people thought they didn't know a letter come out, and for the first time, they start speaking to their parents in full sentences, and they start talking about things that only they would know. And parents just sit there and sob, because it's unbelievable. And they always knew their child was smart. They always believed that there was a lot more there, but now it's confirmed. And we have one kid we've been working with. He's, I have a couple of videos about him on my Instagram. And this kid named Wesley, I mean, he came to us when he was 12. He, never spoke a word his whole life. And he would bite people, and he'd bite himself. And he, they just kind of put him in a room, and they didn't even think he was teachable. And then he came to our office and spelled out in the first session, and was talking to his parents about things. And they were like in shock. And then after 2 weeks, they realized, oh my God, how smart this kid is. And then they started teaching him at home with using the letterboard. And now this kid is actually, we just tested him. He came back a few weeks ago, and we tested him in word reading, and he was reading at a college level. This is a kid that a year and a half ago, he's 13, 14 years old. They didn't believe he knew one letter. And now he's reading at a college level. That's how smart he is. And this kid is starting to speak, but he now is like, he's in control of his body. He doesn't bite himself or anybody anymore. And he has given me so much information. He's so brilliant. It's unbelievable. So I want parents to know that, your kid that's non-speaking, don't let anybody tell you that they're intellectually disabled and they're not in there, and they are, and they're there more than you even know. And so, your instincts are right. And, all we want to do is try to give those kids their voice and not take away their gifts. And that's that's my mission every day. And we're able to do that, to varying degrees in these kids. And it's really, that has been probably one of the most amazing things that I want to shout from the rooftops, because, nobody's going to tell the parents this.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional over here. Yeah, I know that feeling of not being able to hear your child say, I love you, like it's devastating. And, I know that we can all be on there like, oh, autism is amazing and we should embrace them. Absolutely. Sure. Great. But I want to hear my child say, I love you. I want to hear him ask for what he wants. Like,
And I tell you that that's what they say, right? So it's not like we're trying to force them to fit in their world. When they can communicate, the first thing they start saying is, I want to speak so badly. Please help me speak. Please help me stop stimming. Please help me stop, hitting myself. And, I mean, I literally had a 25-year-old man who was non-speaking, who can spell, but, in the interim, he used to cause such damage to himself that he literally caused brain damage. I mean, he looks like he has a stroke on the left side of his body. So, are we supposed to just leave someone like that alone when we can help them? You know what I mean? So, yes, we want to accept them, but we also want them to be the best version of themselves. We don't want to change them, but they want that. They tell us all the time, even when they're fighting us, when we're trying to work with them, we'll have them spell, do you want us to stop? And they say, no, please don't stop. That's just my body fighting me. Don't listen to it. And they say over and over, help me speak. And so, this is coming from them. This isn't from us. And it's not just the parent driving it. They want to be able to speak too.
Yeah. No, I love that so much. And it is emotional because it hits home, right? I have so many parents and so many mums who cry themselves to sleep thinking this wasn't the idea that I had for my child when I was giving birth or being pregnant. Like I was sold the idea that we were going to stand in front of the double-story home with the white picket fence with 2 kids and a dog, and everyone was going to be typical and everyone was going to be excel at their dreams and get the right jobs and do all the things. And then when you're given a diagnosis like autism for your child, it can really, especially for mums, and I say this because obviously of lived experience, but if you don't get your mindset right, there is no way that you can help this child. Like I have seen it time and time again. I myself supplemented with alcohol for a long time because I just wasn't ready to accept the diagnosis. And that was a really hard period of my life. I haven't drunk for 3 years now, but that idea that we need to help as much as we want to help these children, let's help mums as well. Like, let's make sure that they are taken care of so that they can take care of their children, so that they have the bandwidth and the regulation for themselves so that they can co-regulate with their child. So much of it goes together like ham and cheese, and we never look at the parent. We never look at the mum. We always look at the child, which thank goodness we do. I'm not saying not to, but goodness me, there needs to be a space for mums to be able to download what's going on so that they have the energy levels to be able to help their child.
In that, we actually, in our offices, we have an adult section and a child section. And so many times we do work with the parents at the same time we work with their child, because it's the only time they have available while somebody else is doing something. And what we found is that, there is a lot of trauma to the parents, but they also have their own brain imbalances. And what we found is that working on the parents, it actually is reflective in the child. The child also responds. And the child also sees the parent doing the same type of treatments that they're doing. And it becomes a bonding thing. And it really helps both. And it helps regulate the mom's brain and regulate your emotions and your nervous system, and that helps regulate the child. So it really does. We do that. We work with both at the same time, but also, working with a really good therapist or somebody that can also help the parents deal with this. But I think a lot of parents, the frustration is you get a diagnosis and nobody explains what that means. What is it? Why is this like this? And don't explain that it's actually because your child is brilliant and gifted in an area of the brain. And not just for autism, for all neurobehavioral disorders. My daughter's dyslexic, but she's, one of the best singer-songwriters in the world right now, because that gift is there. I have another child that was on the autism spectrum, and he works for me as a doctor now. So, this is, your children are there and you didn't do anything wrong, but you just want real answers. Tell me what is happening. What is autism? And whatever's going on in their body, just don't say, oh, that's autism, with no explanation, right? It drives me crazy. And I think that contributes to the trauma, that you just want to know answers and nobody's giving it. And you don't even feel like you can ask the answers. They shut you down.
Oh, yes, they very much shut you down, or they gaslight you, or they make you feel like you're an idiot.
Right.
And, and of course, we're not as brilliant as you. So we don't have the answers. We don't know how to respond to be able to go, well, I just know there's something like, I've got this mother's instinct that just kicks in. And sometimes that voice isn't always heard from a mother's perspective. But I'm so pleased to hear that you have a parent section as well as a child section, because
Yeah.
so much of it is so interlinked. Like, we are so wired to be linked. We
Yeah.
grew this baby in our belly, for goodness sakes. Of course we're connected. So
Yes.
I love that so much. Dr. Melillo, thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate it. I know it's nighttime over there, so I thank you for coming out and chatting with us. Guys, I will be putting the links to the book, to Dr. Melillo's website, and to the ebook on the show notes, as well as on socials, so you can get anything there. And I look forward to continuing with the Melillo method, continuing with the therapy, and hopefully one day I will come to New York and meet you in person, and I can bring my son and see how we go.
Absolutely. I would love that, because what we do is special. What we do in New York right now, there's no other center quite like it in the world. And so it really is the best place. There's obviously other great practitioners that I've trained, but what we do in New York is unique. So, and again, I want parents just to know, like you said, you may not have the knowledge and feel like you don't have the voice, but I do. And I'm here. I got your back, and I'm going to stand up for you, and I'm going to go out there. And this is what motivates me every day. And I'm not going to stop till I die. So,
God bless you, Dr. Melillo. I am so grateful that you are in this world, and continue your amazing work. And I will chat to you soon.
thank you.
Take care. See you later.